After a near century of relative peace between global powers, the US now stands at the precipice of a new era of international conflict. With ongoing wars in Europe and the Middle East, the looming threat of tensions boiling over in the Pacific, and an American public embroiled in a cultural war of its own, the chances of America finding itself in a large-scale fight unlike any it's seen since the mid-20th century seem to be climbing. And while the technology we usually discuss on this channel can play a vital role in deterring or, if necessary, winning that fight, it would be far from the deciding factor. Because wars are won and lost by the people who fight them. Today, we're going to step away from the tech and discuss the most important resource the American military can bring to bear: the men and women who serve. In recent years, the US Armed Forces has suffered a recruiting crisis, with nearly every branch failing to draw in enough viable candidates to meet the needs of the force. Now today, that crisis appears to have passed, and now the Air Force is leading the charge to rapidly expand its ranks in time to meet the challenges that lie ahead. While today, many Americans feel more at odds with one another than with adversary nations, we don't have to look far to find common ground. In fact, it's right beneath our feet. And while I have confidence that the US could marshal its resources, its people, and its will in time to win the next big fight, even that would be a failure compared to deterring it to begin with. Winning the peace is always better than surviving the war. So let's talk about the threats the US is facing, the challenge of attracting a new generation of warfighters, and how the Air Force seems to be breaking with long-standing recruitment practices to help bridge the ever-growing gap between the American people and its warfighting apparatus. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is a special edition of ManPower. Last week, I flew out to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to attend the Air Force's All-Star Leadership event. And while I was really there to check out some aircraft and speak to some air crews, what I saw surprised me. But to understand why, we need to start with the current state of the world, and why today it's more important than ever that the US military can attract the right kinds of people. On February 24th, 2022, more than 100,000 Russian troops poured over the border into neighboring Ukraine, intent on overwhelming the former Soviet territory and rapidly expanding the dominion of Russia's autocratic leader, Vladimir Putin. Disguised behind claims of NATO aggression and expansion, this seemingly sudden shift toward old-world imperialism wasn't actually sudden at all. In fact, it was just the latest step in a decades-long strategy to pull modern Russia back into the upper echelons of global influence, as laid out by famed Russian political thinker Alexander Dugin all the way back in 1997. Indeed, today, Dugin's book, Foundations of Geopolitics, reads like an eerie retelling of the major events of the past quarter century, penned by a modern-day Nostradamus with an uncanny foresight. Dugin called for using information operations to sway the British populace towards severing economic ties with the European Union, enabling geopolitical shocks in NATO ally Turkey through internal conflict with minority groups throughout the region, and perhaps most notably, directing Russian intelligence operations to sow discord among the American people, exacerbating tensions along political, racial, and social lines until the nation begins waging a cultural war within itself. In reality, of course, Dugin is no psychic. The events he lays out as necessary for Russia's reascension into the small fraternity of global powers did not occur by happenstance. They were guided by the nation's sprawling clandestine influence operations, at least when possible. and through political or even direct kinetic force when not. As prescribed by Dugin's book, Putin's Russia has used its state-owned media empire, armies of real and automated internet content creators, and the geopolitical influence it's garnered as one of the world's largest exporters of both energy and weapons to shape global narratives, aligning with other pariah states like Iran and North Korea that lack the resources to compete in conventional conflict, so they've instead invested heavily into hybrid warfare, or the art of taking offensive action against an adversary that accomplishes strategic objectives without ever crossing the line into open acts of war. But the annexation of Ukraine, which Dugin described as appropriate because the nation has no geopolitical meaning or cultural import due to a lack of, quote, ethnic exclusiveness, did not go as planned. What was meant to be a short-lived special military operation soon devolved into all-out war, with Western weapons and supplies flooding into the embattled nation, working with roughly 1/10 the military footprint of the invaders. Russia's defense budget, which sat at between $61 and $66 billion per year between 2017 and 2021, suddenly ballooned to more than $86 billion in the first year of its war in Ukraine, and is now projected to reach roughly $145 billion in 2025. This flood of defense spending has helped to stave off the economic collapse some predicted would follow international sanctions placed on Russia, but has inadvertently created a new problem the NATO alliance will have to deal with sooner or later: a Russian economy that is now dependent on war. At the same time, nearly 5,000 miles away, a similar threat of modern-day imperialism looms dark in the skies over the Pacific, casting an ominous shadow across the 100-mile stretch of open ocean that separates China from the island nation of Taiwan. Like Russia, China's government has all but done away with the facade of open and free elections, even going so far as to change the nation's constitution to allow its authoritarian leader, Xi Jinping, to stay in power for life. Now free of concerns about the will of his people, Xi has been empowered to pursue the long game, investing heavily into the modernization of the nation's sprawling defense apparatus with the stated aim of having the military capacity to conquer Taiwan by 2027. And to overwhelm the United States in terms of both global and geopolitical power by 2049. Today, China operates the largest number of combat-capable vessels in the world, with over 370 warships operating under the People's Liberation Army Navy banner, and perhaps as many as 400 more large-hulled vessels sailing under the flags of the nation's maritime militia and National Coast Guard, both of which fall directly under the Navy's command. All the while, conflicts continue in places like the Middle East, where the U.S. Navy has been working tirelessly to defend commercial, civilian, and military vessels in the Red Sea, and American troops and equipment are being used to defend Israel from Iran and Iranian proxies. And in Africa, where counter-terror operations and relationship-building support efforts continue in the midst of fierce competition with nations like China and Russia for influence in the developing world. Simmering tensions on the Korean peninsula, where yet another despot, North Korea's Kim Jong-un, has aligned himself with Russian and Chinese autocracies, likewise demands the attention of American deterrent forces as the nation continues to aggressively flex its newfound nuclear might. The truth is, the near-century-spanning era of relative global peace brought about by the end of World War II appears to be approaching an end, as the world's most powerful nations once again find themselves aligning on opposite sides of an economic and geopolitical conflict decoratively adorned in warring political ideologies. And as the United States once again finds itself experiencing the familiar anxiety of great power competition, it does so in a world that has little in common with the last Cold War. The modern attention-based media economy has incentivized sensationalism and hyperbole, and with it has driven divisions between the populace. Social media has made it possible for foreign influence operations to engage directly with individual Americans, using messaging that's tailored to their pre-existing beliefs and senses of political identity to decimate the trust Americans have in one another, in national institutions, and in the government itself. The United States, deeply imperfect as it is, remains a shining example of accountability when objectively juxtaposed against the authoritarian regimes it's competing with. But in a world where objectivity is increasingly difficult to come by, America's willingness to acknowledge its failings makes it seem like one of the only nations that has them, feeding directly into Dugin's prescribed strategy for making America the world's scapegoat. And while America's economic might has allowed it to continue to develop and field the most advanced military technologies and capabilities on the world stage, the converging efforts of foreign adversaries pouring fuel onto the fires of naturally occurring cultural divisions, disillusionment spurred by more than 2 decades of war with no discernible benefit to the American people, and America's genuine failings when it comes to meeting the needs of its veteran population, the nation now finds itself struggling to field the one vital military asset no amount of money can buy: public trust. All the way back on January 27, 1973, then-serving Defense Secretary Melvin R. Laird announced to the nation that, quote, "The armed forces henceforth will depend exclusively on volunteer soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Use of the draft has ended." It marked the end of a system America had relied on to field its world-leading military for more than 3 decades across 3 major conflicts: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And while it was a welcome change to many, it didn't come without its detractors. In fact, within the offices of those tasked with organizing America's defense, the shift had few fans. But 9 months after Laird's historic announcement, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an embargo on nations that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, creating an oil crisis in the United States that was followed just 1 month later by the onset of the 1973 recession. Over 2.3 million Americans ultimately lost their jobs in this recession. And while that was bad news for Americans in general, it was good news for military recruiting, as many Americans saw service as a safe and steady source of income amid that economic uncertainty. That recruiting boom helped keep the all-volunteer concept viable throughout those controversial early years. And by 1991's Gulf War, America's battlefield dominance silenced any remaining detractors, as it proved just how good a well-trained and well-equipped all-volunteer force really could be. But today, some 33 years later, the U.S. is once again finding itself having difficult conversations about the viability of an all-volunteer force in an increasingly unstable world. In July of 2023, Gallup reported that the American public's trust in its military was at its lowest since 1988, and worse, was in a continued decline that had spanned the past 5 years running. By December, every military branch, with the exception of the Marine Corps and the newly founded Space Force, announced their failures to meet their respective recruiting goals. The Army was hit the hardest, reaching 77% of its recruitment numbers. The Navy followed at 80%, and then the Air Force missed its recruitment goal for the first time in nearly a quarter century, reaching just 89% of its target. But since those gloomy days of 2023, military recruitment has seen a resurgence. In fiscal year 2024, which ended on September 30th, the Army, Marines, Space Force, and Air Force all met their recruiting goals, with the Navy falling only just short of its own. Each branch took different approaches to corrective action, with most loosening restrictions on things like medical waivers and tattoos. And today, the outlook is positive enough that most branches are even increasing their targets for 2025. The Army, which achieved the largest numerical comeback thanks in part to the largest advertising spend at roughly $20,000 for every new recruit in 2024, will increase its recruiting goal by roughly 10% next year, up to 61,000 troops to be recruited by some 10,900 soldiers and civilian Army recruiters. That shakes out to roughly 5 or 6 new recruits per recruiter in 2025. But the Air Force is taking the most aggressive stance, with a whopping 20% increase in its recruitment goals for 2025, up from 27,100 to 32,500 new airmen. But while this figure is just about half that of the Army's target, the Air Force intends to achieve it with a much leaner recruiting staff of just 1,767 recruiting personnel, which even itself reflects an added 377 recruiters the Air Force aims to field in the coming year. Now that shakes out to between 18 and 19 new recruits for every single Air Force recruiter, between 3 and 4 times that of the Army average. The Air Force has always been one to aim high, but in order to reach this target, the branch will have to do something many fear isn't possible. It'll have to convince the public to trust the military again. In order to hit these aggressive goals without lowering standards, something Air Force Recruiting Command has been clear is not an option, the branch needs to rebuild the increasingly severed connection between the American public and its military. As Air Force Recruiting Commander Brigadier General Christopher R. Amrine explained to the Senate Armed Services Committee last year, back in 1995, roughly 40% of American youths reported having a parent who served in the military. But today, that figure has dwindled to just 12%. And this is a big problem because data shows that most new recruits come from families with direct military ties. In 2015, a Defense Department Joint Advertising Market Research and Studies report determined that 25% of new recruits had a direct parent who served, and 75% had a close family member, a sibling, aunt, uncle, or grandparent who did. In 2016, 45% of service members surveyed by the Blue Star Family's annual poll said they had a parent who served, and 47% of military spouses said the same. This reduction in young Americans with those ties to the military has resulted in what Amy Schaefer, a researcher at the Center for New American Security, famously described as the American warrior caste, a small subset of American families from which the majority of new service members are recruited. Schaefer also highlighted that there's at least an apparent correlation between the dwindling number of Americans with ties to the military and the public's dwindling trust in the institutions that make it up. This growing military-civilian divide is easy to quantify in lots of ways. In fact, according to the Defense Department, only about 27% of young Americans can even correctly name all 5 military branches. And if the populace is lacking this basic understanding of the service, it goes without saying that, to most Americans, the inner workings of the military lifestyle are a complete mystery. But solving this problem can't be done through most traditional military recruiting campaigns. No matter how exciting or dynamic your commercial, it can't assuage all the intangible concerns parents have about their kids donning the uniform, nor can it shine a light on the sometimes monotonous day-to-day realities of service. Commercials, posters, military flyovers, and the like all sell prospective recruits on an action movie that they may never actually see. And in reality, many young Americans and their nervous parents aren't interested in living that movie in the first place. Trust between young Americans, their parents, and the military can't be gained through advertising dollars alone. And because popular perceptions of military recruiters portray them as dishonest, conversations around the coffee table aren't going to cut it either. As Major General Ed Thomas, commander of the Air Force Recruiting Service, explained last year, there is no single silver bullet or game-changing strategy the Air Force can use to instantly reconnect the American people with its airmen. According to Thomas, the only path forward is in, quote, increasing community outreach, getting out into the communities and reintroducing ourselves to America. I don't just mean getting outside the gates of Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio or Altus, Oklahoma. We must get out and provide meaningful exposure to our men and women in uniform across the nation, in the hard-to-recruit areas, and in all the places where Americans are not likely to know anyone in the military. And that is exactly what I saw in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. To tell you the truth, I flew out there to poke around some aircraft at the Air National Guard base that's co-located with the city's international airport during the Air Force's All-Star Leadership event. And as I interviewed pilots and aircrew for some short video pieces that I'll be posting later, I watched as hundreds of high school students poured onto the flight line, milling about the KC-135, C-17s, and the F-16D that I was also there to see. What I saw was not a recruiting event as I know them. In fact, I spoke to very few recruiters at all while I was there. Instead, airmen from a wide variety of occupational specialties set up shop around tables or in their respective aircraft, answering questions and just generally letting these kids explore the machines they work on, in, or alongside every day. One airman showed off 3D printed toys and aircraft components, answering questions about the printers the Air Force is using to change the way it repairs aircraft. Another showed off different aircrew equipment and gear, while others explained airborne refueling, cargo operations, and more. It was an environment utterly bereft of advertising or the pressure sale of a recruiter in dire need of hitting a quota. It was just young men and women in uniform sharing their real lived experiences with high school students who were genuinely interested in learning more about the realities of their lives. In fact, as I interviewed a pair of flight nurses about their time in various aircraft, a pair of high school girls lined up behind me, and after a few minutes, they expressed their disgust in how long I was taking with an audible sigh. They were that excited to speak to these airmen about what they did, and that had such an impact on me that I decided I needed to make this video. I felt like the Grinch when his heart grew 3 sizes, watching these girls get excited about service. As I thought back to something my wife told me nearly 2 decades ago, that it never even occurred to her that she could have become something like a fighter pilot. And maybe all it could have taken to send her life in a completely different direction was one conversation with someone who knew that she could, and who'd look her in the eye and tell her so. The military is not for everyone. In fact, it isn't for most people, but for me, it gave me the chance to climb the socioeconomic ladder out of the trailer park I came from, to get my associate's degree, and then my bachelor's degree, and then my master's degree. It gave me the means to leave a life of turning wrenches, busted knuckles, and late payments for a career doing what I'm passionate about that pays well enough to support a family that I love. But for lots of young men and women, just like I was, the military doesn't feel like an option so much as a foreign concept meant for others at best, and a ticket to dying in combat or coming back a broken veteran at worst. But the realities of service are so much more than kicking in doors or dropping bombs. It's learning skills, creating deep and lasting friendships, and being a part of something that's so much bigger than yourself. And while that something bigger that service makes you a part of isn't perfect, and it can indeed be wrought with risk at times, it's just as important that we not lose sight of the bigger picture, those looming threats on the horizon. Because in a worst-case scenario, those smiling men and women sharing their stories and experiences with high school kids in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, will be called on to take those skills they've honed and put them to good use, standing between our nation's adversaries and its interests, or maybe even standing between those adversaries and the rest of us here at home. And while I hope that day never comes, I'm reminded of the words of my old commander, Colonel Don Themey, when he told me, hope is not a course of action. If we want to prevent the next big war before it starts, it can only happen through a strong deterrent military posture that makes it clear that armed conflict is not worth the price of admission. And while fighter jets and bombers and aircraft carriers and tanks all play a role in that combat calculus, they are completely worthless without well-trained men and women who are willing to carry the nation's burden on their backs. And what I saw in Pittsburgh last week was the first time in a long time that I felt confident that a new generation might just be willing to help carry that load. They just need to be shown a reason to believe that it could be worth it for them. They need someone who knows they can, to look them in the eyes and tell them so. And real talk, me to you, I was so happy to see that happening that this salty old Marine flew home wearing an Air Force cap on my head. And it didn't even catch on fire. And with that ends this special edition of ManPower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.